7:14 a.m. on a Wednesday in March. My name is Diane. I'm 44 years old, and at 7:14 on a Wednesday morning in March, I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my husband's laptop, looking for a restaurant confirmation when I found the lease instead. Greg had asked me to check the reservation at Oast House, whether it was 6:30 or 7. He had already left for work, and his phone was somewhere in the car, and I was already at the laptop paying bills, and it seemed like the fastest solution. I typed the restaurant name into the search bar. The first result was not from the restaurant. It was from a property management company in Nashville, Tennessee. The subject line read, "Lease Renewal Reminder, Unit 4B. Please respond within 30 days." I don't know exactly why I opened it. It wasn't the restaurant, and I knew it wasn't the restaurant. The practical thing would have been to scroll past it. I think what stopped me was the word Nashville, because Greg traveled to Nashville often. He was a regional vice president, and the company had a significant vendor relationship there, and so some reflex fired, some vague wifely attention to detail, and I clicked the email. I read it. A furnished one-bedroom apartment in the Lakeview neighborhood of Nashville, Unit 4B, initial lease term, 24 months, current month, 14, renewal required within 30 days to continue occupancy. Tenants listed, Greg Aldrin, Allison V. I sat very still. Then I scrolled to the attachment, the lease agreement, signed and dated 14 months ago. His signature at the bottom, the same signature I had watched him write on our mortgage, on our tax returns, on our daughter's college cosign paperwork. I looked at the date on those signatures for a long moment. Then I typed Oast House into the search bar again, found the reservation, 6:30, party of 6, and closed the laptop. When Greg called from the car 20 minutes later to ask if I'd found it, I said yes, 6:30. He said great. He said he'd be home by 5. I said okay. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. Tell me the last thing you found and immediately explained away. Not something that turned out to be nothing. Something you found and built a tidy story around in the 40 seconds before the full meaning arrived, because the full meaning was too large to absorb all at once. I had been building those stories for months without knowing I was building them. A conference call that ran through dinner, a weekend in Nashville that extended by a day because of a vendor emergency, a text he stepped outside to answer. Small things, each one plausible on its own, each one absorbed and filed and set aside. Tell me what you explained away in the comments. I'll show you what I explained away for 6 weeks. Greg and I had been married for 17 years. We met in our late 20s, at the kind of stage where both of us were still half assembled, working jobs we hadn't decided were permanent yet, living in apartments with furniture we'd chosen quickly, telling ourselves we'd figure the rest out later. We figured some of it out together. We moved to Austin when Greg took the regional VP role, which was earlier than either of us had expected. We bought the house with the live oak out front that was already enormous when we moved in, and we joked that the tree had been there longer than either of our parents and would probably outlast us both, which at the time felt like a point in the tree's favor. I had worked as a consultant in communications and operations for most of our marriage, full-time in the early years, then part-time after our daughter Mara was born. Greg's income could support us, and Mara needed consistency more than we needed my full salary, and so I shifted. It made sense. We had talked about it, had agreed on it together, had revisited it every few years, and confirmed it still made sense. By the time this story begins, Mara was in her second year of college, doing well, calling me on Tuesday evenings just to talk, and I had started taking on more consulting work again as the house got quieter. Greg's career had continued to grow. The Nashville relationship had become central to his regional portfolio. He had been traveling more over the last year and a half, something about a vendor consolidation that required more hands-on management, and I had not thought much about it, because this was the nature of his work, had always been the nature of his work, and I had no particular reason to think about it differently than I had thought about it for the previous decade. We had 37 guests confirmed for Greg's 50th birthday party, 8 weeks out. I had booked the private dining room at a restaurant we'd used for events before, warm, draped, the kind of space that holds 37 people without feeling crowded. Both families were coming, his parents, my parents, his brother and sister-in-law, our oldest friends, the neighbors who had been at our dinner table for years. I had confirmed the caterer. I had roughed out a seating chart. I had started looking at what the programs might say. Greg had been resistant to a big party for most of his 40s. He was not a fuss person. Usually, he preferred dinners to events. But 50 had felt different to both of us. I had argued that 50 deserved a fuss, and he had agreed, had seemed genuinely pleased about it in the weeks since I'd started planning. He said it felt right to mark the things that matter. I found the lease 8 weeks before that party. I want you to hold that detail. When Greg left for work the following morning, I sat down at the laptop again. I went back to the email from the property management company and read it all the way through, slowly, the way you read something when you already understand what it is and are simply confirming each piece. The lease was for a furnished one-bedroom in a building called the Lakeview Terrace. The initial term had begun 14 months ago. The monthly rent was listed. The unit had been leased to both Greg Aldrin and Allison V., with both signatures on the agreement, which was attached in full. I opened the attachment. Both signatures. His at the bottom right of each page, Allison V. At the bottom left, initials in the margin. The lease start date, 14 months ago, a month Greg had spent largely in Nashville due to what he had described as a critical vendor transition. I read through the full document. Then I opened a new browser tab and created a new email address I had never used before. I forwarded the lease to that address. Then I deleted the draft from Greg's sent folder, cleared the browser history, and closed the laptop. I went and made myself a second cup of coffee. I want to be honest with you about the next step, because I think it matters. What I did not do is react. I did not call Greg. I did not call a friend. I did not cry, although there was a moment that morning where I could feel the crying waiting, a specific tightness in the throat that I recognized and held very still until it passed. I got a legal pad from my office, and I sat back down at the table, and I started writing things down in a list. The lease, the dates, Allison V., the Nashville trips I could remember from the last 14 months. Not because I was calm. I want to be clear that I was not calm. But I knew that whatever I was feeling right now, I would need the information to still be accurate on the other side of the feeling. That afternoon, I opened Greg's Venmo. We shared a joint account for household expenses, but we each had our own Venmo history. His was connected to the same email. I had never had a reason to look at it. The thought had simply never arrived. The contact was saved as Allie, with a small red heart after the name. I scrolled back 16 months. Payments every few weeks. $40, $60, sometimes $300 or $400 at a stretch. Each one labeled with something that could be anything. Dinner. Thank you. Gas. February's. One in the fall that said only, I'm sorry. 16 months of Allie with the red heart. 16 months of I'm sorry. I took screenshots of every transaction and sent them to the new email address. I deleted the sent folder. I cleared the history. I put the phone down on the counter and stood at the window for a while looking at the backyard. 16 months. That number stayed with me longer than any of the others. The apartment had been 14 months, but the Venmo went back 16. 2 months before the lease. 2 months that I could not account for yet. 2 months during which there had been payments to Allie with a red heart, and I had been in this house, in this life, making no particular distinction between that year and any other year. I thought about the specific texture of those months, Mara finishing her first year of high school, a trip we had taken together as a family to the coast, Greg, me, Mara, 4 days in a rental house, playing cards at night, cooking fish on a grill that barely worked, the three of us happy in the way that families are happy when they are simply together without agenda. I had thought about that trip often since then, as an example of what we were building. What I wanted Mara to carry with her when she left home. I stood at the window for a long time. I want to stop here and tell you what I noticed. I was not going through this the way I had imagined I might go through something like this, in whatever vague way I had ever imagined it. There was no screaming in my head. There was something quieter, something more like a gear settling into a new position, a click of understanding, a shift in orientation. I understood something about my life that I had not understood before. And now I needed to understand the full shape of it before I could decide what to do. 2 days later, I called the airline. We had a shared travel account through Greg's company benefits, flights, hotels, rental cars. I had used it occasionally for family travel. I called the service number and asked for a history of flights booked on the account for the past 18 months. The representative gave a brief pause. Then she started reading. 22 flights to Nashville in 14 months. I had known about perhaps 8 or 9 of them. The rest had been scheduled on weeks when I was traveling for my own consulting work, or when Greg was already on the road for something else, or on weekends when I hadn't been paying close attention to his itinerary. 22 flights, an average of 1.5 a month. I thanked the representative and ended the call. I sat in the driveway of our house for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I was looking at the clock on the dashboard, watching it. Then I went inside and started making dinner. In the 4th week, I contacted an attorney. I had found her independently, not through a friend, not through anyone in our social world, someone whose office was on the other side of the city and who had no overlap with our life. I told her on the first call that I was not ready to file anything. I needed to understand the financial picture and what documentation I should preserve. She told me that was exactly the right way to start. We met for 2 hours that week. She was a quiet woman with a methodical way of speaking. She explained things completely and waited to see if you had questions before moving to the next thing, which I appreciated. She walked me through what was relevant under Texas law, joint assets, the length of the marriage, and what she called dissipation, funds spent by one spouse outside the marriage during the period of the affair. The Venmo payments and the Nashville apartment rent both qualified. The documentation I had gathered was a strong foundation for a dissipation claim. She also flagged something I hadn't yet thought to look at: wire transfers. I went to our joint bank account the next day and pulled 3 years of statements. There were 4 transfers in the last 16 months that I did not recognize, going to an account I could not identify. The total was $14,300. Greg handled the household finances, and I had trusted that, had signed the tax returns each April and not read them with particular attention, because trust is what you do when you believe in the partnership. I want to be careful here, because I think people sometimes read a sentence like, Greg handled the household finances, as evidence of naivety, and I don't think that's what it was. It was a division of labor. I handled the consulting work, the household scheduling, the school logistics when Mara was younger, the social calendar. He handled the accounts, the investments, the mortgage payments, the taxes. We had divided it the way 2 adults divide a shared life when they believe it is genuinely shared. I had not stopped paying attention because I was careless. I had stopped paying attention because I was attending to other things, and I believed we were a unit. $14,300. I printed the statements. I added them to the folder. By the end of the 5th week, I had a physical folder in a filing cabinet in my home office, where Greg had never had occasion to look. Inside, the lease, printed, the Venmo history, all 16 months, printed and dated, the airline list, annotated, the bank transfers, a timeline I had typed myself, beginning with the earliest Nashville flight I could now confirm, which had been booked, I discovered, 3 weeks before Greg received the formal Nashville promotion that had supposedly necessitated the increased travel. 3 weeks before. The promotion had not created the travel. The travel had preceded the promotion by 3 weeks. I noted that on the timeline. During this entire period, Greg was present. I want to say that clearly because it was the strangest part of those 6 weeks. Stranger, in some ways, than what I had found. He was attentive. He cooked dinner twice in the 3rd week, which was unusual. He asked about my consulting projects. On a Friday evening, near the end of the 4th week, he came and sat beside me on the couch while I was reading and put his hand on top of mine without saying anything, just sat there, which was a thing he did sometimes when he was in a certain mood, a gentle mood, a mood of wanting to be close. I kept reading. He did not notice anything different in me. I want to say that surprised me, but if I am being honest, it did not. In the 5th week, he sent me a draft of the toast he was planning to give at his birthday party. He had written it privately and wanted my thoughts. The email said, "Rough draft. Be honest." I opened it. He thanked his parents for making him feel like the kind of person who was worth celebrating. He thanked his colleagues by name, 3 of them, for the specific ways they had shaped his thinking. He said something about his brother that was genuinely funny and that his brother would appreciate. He spoke about Mara, who couldn't make it home from college for the party but had sent a short video that would play during dinner, with the kind of specific warmth that parents feel when their children have turned out to be people they genuinely like. And then he reached the end. Diane has been my partner, my anchor, my home for 17 years. She is the reason this life looks the way it does, and I don't say that enough. Tonight I want to say it, out loud, in front of the people who matter most to us, because she deserves to hear it said, in a room full of witnesses. I read it 3 times. Then I typed back, "It's good. Say exactly that." I want to stop here, again, because this was the hardest moment of the 6 weeks, and I think it deserves honesty. In the days after I read his toast draft, I thought about not going through with it. Not because I had forgiven anything, not because I thought the marriage could be repaired, or that I wanted it to be, but because what I had planned was going to land in a room full of people, his mother, my parents, friends who had been at our wedding, and none of them had any part in any of this, and I am not someone who is comfortable causing damage that extends beyond its intended target. I sat with that for 3 days. During those 3 days, I went about everything normally. I made the final call to the caterer. I confirmed the seating chart. I proofread the programs. Greg came home and ate dinner and asked about my week, and I told him about a client call that had gone well, a project that was expanding in a direction I hadn't expected. We talked about Mara, a professor she'd mentioned, a trip she was considering with friends. We talked about the party, whether the room would be warm enough given the size of the group, whether his brother's flight was still on schedule. I was fully present for every one of those conversations. And I was simultaneously working through a question that I could not answer by talking to anyone, whether the truth, once it existed in a room, belonged only to the 2 people at the center of it, or whether it also belonged to the people who had been living around its edges without knowing it was there. What resolved it for me was not the Venmo. It was not the $14,000. It was not even the apartment lease. It was a timestamp. I had been going through the folder for the 6th or 7th time when I looked closely at the booking confirmation for a Nashville flight from 14 months ago, specifically the date the booking had been made. 3 days before I drove Mara to college, we had still been at the house together as a family, her boxes stacked in the hallway, the whole bittersweet countdown of a child leaving for the first time. Greg had been home for those days. He had helped carry boxes down from her room. He had been patient with her anxiety and cheerful in the way that parents are cheerful when they're covering their own sadness. He had booked the Nashville flight on that Wednesday, while her boxes were still in the hallway, while I was still measuring whether we had packed enough of the right things for her. He had already decided where he was going after we dropped her off. I closed the folder. I finished planning his 50th birthday party. I want to be precise about when the decision happened, because I think precision matters here. It was not the morning I found the lease. It was not the attorney meeting, or the airline call, or the moment I read his toast draft. It was the Wednesday afternoon I looked at that flight timestamp and understood that he had booked the trip while Mara's boxes were still in our hallway. And I want to be equally precise about what the decision was. Not to punish him, not to cause a scene for the sake of causing a scene, not to perform my grief in front of 37 people who would have to carry that image for the rest of their lives, but to be done, completely and irreversibly done, and to ensure that the people in that room, the people whose relationship with our marriage had been built on his version of things, would have the truth directly in their hands before he finished speaking. He had written, "She is the reason this life looks the way it does." I thought about that sentence for a long time, and then I went to the office supply store and bought 37 envelopes, the night of the party. I arrived at the venue an hour before the guests. The caterers were setting up. The florist had finished and gone. The room was warm, draped tables, low lighting, the kind of space that looks like the inside of a celebration before anyone arrives to celebrate in it. I moved through the room alone. At each adult place setting, I lifted the dinner plate and slid a sealed envelope beneath it. I worked methodically, table by table, starting at the far end and moving toward the door. The children's table, 4 kids under 12, none of them responsible for anything, I left untouched. The rest, his parents' seats, my parents' seats, his brother and sister-in-law, the colleagues he had thanked by name in his toast draft, the neighbors, the friends who had been calling Greg and me a unit for so long that they had probably stopped seeing us separately. Every plate, each envelope contained 2 pages. The first page was a document I had prepared, a timeline, 14 months of flights, dated and listed, 16 months of Venmo payments, totaled, 4 bank transfers, amounts and dates, the Nashville apartment address, unit number, lease term, both names on the agreement, $14,300 in documented funds, everything sourced, everything dated, everything verifiable. The second page was a printout of his toast draft. I had highlighted one sentence in yellow, "She is the reason this life looks the way it does." I placed the last envelope, straightened the plate above it, and went to my seat at the head table. I ordered a sparkling water. I looked at the room. Greg arrived 30 minutes later with his brother, both of them laughing about something from the car. He looked happy. He genuinely looked happy, relaxed and expansive in the way that people look when they have been dreading a milestone and have now arrived at it and found it isn't as heavy as they feared. He looked like a man who was grateful for his life. He found me immediately, came to where I was sitting, leaned down and kissed me on the cheek and said, "You did all of this." I said, "I did." He squeezed my shoulder and went to find his parents. Guests arrived in a steady stream. His mother came in with his father and immediately found me and held both my hands and said the room was beautiful. My parents arrived a few minutes later. My father slightly overdressed in the way he always was for events, my mother scanning the room immediately for anyone she recognized. The colleagues Greg had thanked in his toast draft came together in a group, already easy and laughing, the way colleagues are when they're outside the office, and slightly relieved to be there. The neighbors, the friends from the early Austin years, the people who had watched Mara grow up, who had been at our dinner table more times than I could count. I greeted each of them. I asked about their drives, their flights, their kids. I was warm and present and glad to see them, because I genuinely was. None of them had done anything wrong. They were here because they cared about Greg, and some of them because they cared about me, and a few of them because both things were true in equal measure. The dinner went the way dinners go. His mother sat near my mother, and they talked, as they always did, about Mara, about Mara's professor, about the trip Mara was planning with friends. Greg's brother delivered a short introductory speech full of the kind of older brother detail that made the whole room laugh in the specific way that rooms laugh when something is both funny and affectionate. The caterers moved. The wine was poured. The room hummed. No one looked under their plates during dinner. I had counted on that. After the main course, after the laughter, after the video from Mara played, and Greg pressed his hand to his mouth for a moment, the way he did when something moved him, his brother introduced him properly. Greg stood. He started with his parents. He spoke slowly and with real warmth, and I could see his mother's eyes fill the way they filled at anything involving her son. He thanked his colleagues by name. He said the funny thing about his brother, and the brother covered his face with a napkin, and the room laughed the way a room laughs when something is both funny and true. Then he looked at me. He said, 17 years. I stood up. I picked up my purse from the back of my chair, just the way you would if you were stepping away for a moment, nothing dramatic, nothing that would read as anything other than ordinary, and I began walking toward the door of the private room. Greg was still talking. I could hear his voice behind me, steady and warm. Diane has been my partner, he said. At table 3, his brother's table, I heard the first sound, a crisp, clean sound, the particular sound of a sealed envelope being opened with care. Then from the center of the room, another. My anchor, Greg said, my home. I reached the hallway door. I put my hand on the frame. I heard the room change, not loudly, not all at once. But the quality of the silence shifted in a way that anyone who has ever been in a room when a single piece of shared information arrives will recognize. Not noise, its opposite. The specific hush of 30 people receiving the same thing at slightly different speeds. Greg stopped speaking mid-sentence. I did not turn around. I drove home. I turned my phone off about a mile from the venue because I knew what was coming and I was not ready for it yet. I needed the drive to be quiet. The live oak was lit by the front porch light when I pulled in, enormous and patient, exactly as it had always been. I sat in the car for a few minutes. Then I went inside. Mara called the next morning. She had seen the video message from her dad, had been following along with the party in her mind the way she always did when she couldn't be home, and something about my silence the night before. I had sent her a single text that said everything went fine, which in retrospect was not convincing, had made her call. I answered. She said, Mom, and in the way she said it, I knew that she had suspected something for a while. She told me there had been a visit home in the fall, a weekend she hadn't mentioned, when she had seen a text on her father's phone when it lit up on the counter and hadn't known what to do with it. She said she was sorry she hadn't said anything. She said she hadn't known how. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. We talked for almost an hour. By the end of it, we were making plans. Not large plans yet, Not the full architecture of a new arrangement, but the small adjacent plans that you make when two people are deciding to walk forward together. She would come home for spring break regardless. I would call her whenever I needed to. We were going to be okay. I filed 3 weeks after the party. It was not uncomplicated. Nothing like this is. But it was not a war either. Greg had retained an attorney by then, and the initial communications were formal and restrained. The documentation I had assembled, the timeline, the bank transfers, the Venmo history, the lease, made the dissipation claim straightforward. The division of assets took time, but proceeded without the kind of escalation that drags these things out for years. My attorney told me, more than once, that I had done the preparation work of someone who understood the difference between reacting and positioning. I understood the difference because she had explained it to me on day 4. His mother called me once, about 6 weeks after I filed. She had left a message I hadn't returned, and she called again on a Sunday afternoon, and I answered. She said she was sorry. She said she was sorry it had gone the way it had. I told her I was too, and I meant it, because she had been kind to me in her particular way, and this was not something she had chosen. She asked about Mara. I told her Mara was doing well. She said, "Good. That's the important part." I thought about that for a while after we hung up. My parents are well. Mara is thriving. She called me last Tuesday to tell me about a professor she likes, the way she always calls to tell me about the things that are exciting her, and we talked for 40 minutes. I am consulting full-time again, and there is something in having my name on every invoice, in being the one who sends the proposals and receives the payments and decides the terms, that has clarified something for me about the years I thought of as a partnership, but apparently was not. I think about the room sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. The sound of the first envelope opening, the way the silence changed before Greg stopped speaking, what it would have felt like to stand there and perform the confrontation myself, to be the one crying, or accusing, or demanding that the room understand, and how grateful I am that I didn't have to be that person. The truth arrived in envelopes. It arrived without my voice. It arrived in the hands of the people who had been standing in his version of our life, and they were able to arrive at their own understanding of it. I was already at the door by the time it landed. You are allowed to let the truth do the arriving without you. You are allowed to prepare in silence and act without a speech. You are allowed to place the evidence and walk out and let the room figure out the rest. You are allowed to be done. If you'd had 6 weeks with the truth, and 37 guests confirmed, and his toast draft open on your laptop, would you have done the same thing, or would you have handled it differently? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. This story is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. The names, details, and events are invented. If you take one thing from it, let it be this: composure is not the same as forgiveness, and leaving quietly is not the same as losing.